Good evening and welcome. And welcome to the end of capitalism. Sorry, it's the talk, not the reality that we know as yet. But in any case, welcome to the talk, The End of Capitalism, Exploring the Emerging Future, presentations by authors Peter Frase and Richard Seymour. My name is Vivian Schmidt. I'm the Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration and Director of the Center for the Study of Europe here at Boston University. So our event this evening is taking place as part of a longer-term project entitled EU Futures, the aim of which is to explore the emerging future in Europe. It is the third of what we hope will be 7 lectures in a series called Interferences on the prospects of democratic politics in Europe in the aftermath of the recent financial crisis. And I should add, and ongoing Eurozone crisis. The project is funded by a Getting to Know Europe grant to the Center for the Study of Europe from the European Commission delegation in Washington, D.C. We're very grateful to the Commission for their support for our initiative, and that is the delegation. Tonight's event is moderated by Nicole Ashoff, managing editor at Jacobin and the author of The New Prophets of Capital. Before I turn the floor over to Nicole, who will introduce our speakers, I'd like to take a minute to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. This event is being recorded. And also, if you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A, please wait for the microphone. The event will be followed by a reception and book signing, to which you're all cordially invited. Thank you, and over to you.
All right. Can everybody hear me here? Yes? Okay. Well, thank you for coming to the End of Capitalism. I would like to introduce the speakers, which I'm very pleased that both of them were able to make it, and I think it's going to be a really interesting set of talks tonight. Richard Seymour is going to go up first. As you obviously know, Richard is the author of Corbyn, The Strange Rebirth of Radical Politics. He's also written a number of other books, including The Liberal Defense of Murder, Unhitched, The Trial of Christopher Hitchens, and Against Austerity. Richard is finishing a PhD at the London School of Economics, and he's also a founding editor of Salvage magazine. And I'm also very happy to introduce my Jacobin comrade, Peter Frase. Peter is an editor at Jacobin and also a longtime sort of core contributor to the magazine. He's talking tonight about his book, 4 Futures, Life After Capitalism. And Peter has written for a number of other outlets, including In These Times and Al Jazeera. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Richard, who's going to talk for about 20, 25 minutes. And then Peter will talk directly after, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. All right.
Okay, so, oh God. When we talk about transitioning away from capitalism, it can sound like an incredibly abstract and distant and remote prospect. As I see it, my role here is to try to bridge that gap a little bit and make it seem slightly more credible. Of course, Karl Marx's approach to this question was famously to resist any talk of blueprints. We can't talk about a socialist utopia. We have to talk about building up the capacities of socialism in the present. We have to look at the interstices of the here and now and think about how we can work with the grain of contemporary tendencies. And in that way, we can start to move towards socialism far more concretely than if we design a blueprint toward which we have to work. So, in a way, in the UK at least, and this is happening in a number of industrial democracies, to some extent in the US with the Sanders phenomenon, the idea of a left, which has been forgotten for decades, is being reconstituted around the idea of a left government. And not even a very radical left government, it has to be said. I'll come back to this, but certainly not as radical as Syriza was intended to be. And probably just about as left-wing as the climate in the UK at the moment would allow. But more important than the idea of a left government, perhaps, is the idea of a left party. That is, the idea of representation. You see, there's a feeling among a growing number of people that we're not represented and that it's about time that we had a party. And what Jeremy Corbyn in the British Labour Party was able to offer was the bargain of a lifetime. You could pay just £3 and you could finish off the Blairite scum. I mean, the Blairites, some of you don't know what I'm talking about. The Blairites are the most right-wing tendency in social democracy in Europe. Let's put it like that. You could finish off the Blairites forever and have a big, well-funded, trade union-backed and affiliated party with parliamentary representation, a party of the left that represents you. And well, that's a hell of an offer. And many people took it up. Hundreds of thousands, in fact, took it up. But they wouldn't have taken it up at another time. So the fact that they did tells us something about the nature of the crisis of the present and the nature of the tendencies with which we have to work in order to make socialism a far more realizable prospect. The left, it has to be said, certainly the British left, did nothing to deserve this momentous opportunity. This is something that emerged very much within the crevices of capitalism. And that's why we have to start by talking about the nature of the crisis rather than talking more positively about the kinds of alternatives that we'd like to see. So I want to start off by talking about the conjunctural aspects, that is, the aspects of this situation that we're in today that make it possible even to talk about reconstituting something like a radical left. First of all, we all know that there's been a crisis of capitalism in one form or another since 2008, and we can talk about its various mutations. We start off with a crisis of the financial system, with the freezing up of the credit supply system, and essentially that exposed the fundamentally rotten nature of the subprime housing market, and also the fragilities of a whole system of consumption based upon speculation and debt, which was particularly strong in the United States and in the United Kingdom. Millions and millions of people were made to feel far more wealthy than they really were because they were able to get debt. And if you owned a house, or at least if you mortgaged a house, not quite the same thing, you could feel even more wealthy because you could borrow against the value of the house. And if the property markets were going berserk, as they usually are, particularly if you've got scarcity in the housing market, then you can borrow against an ever-rising value of your property. So that's something that was exposed. The limitations of that was exposed in 2008. But then you had other mutations. You had the spread of this crisis into the general economy, and the fact that increasingly for the last decades, in almost all the core industrial democracies, capital has been unwilling to invest. Now, where they have invested, profits have been quite high. Rates of profit have been higher than usual. But that's because they're not investing in the rest of the economy. In other words, they're hoarding hundreds of billions of dollars, of capital that could be invested. So the system is incredibly weak. Beyond that, you've had a shift of the crisis into the domain of the state in the form of sovereign debt crises. And those sovereign debt crises essentially involve, particularly large parts of, in Europe at any rate, large parts of southern and peripheral Europe, essentially having to go into debt because the rest of Europe went into surplus. So it was a forced situation, and they've been punished for that. And then, of course, subsequently, the crisis was transferred onto the general public in the form of austerity, meaning that the costs of the crisis were eventually transferred through several mutations into crises or into costs that were borne by recipients of welfare, by recipients of public services, by recipients of healthcare, by recipients of pensions, by disabled people, by migrants, and so on and so on and so on. So that's some of the ways in which the crisis of an economy turned into a crisis, a generalized crisis of politics and ideology, because it was mutated in and through the state. And in doing so, it accentuated and accelerated a general crisis in representation. For the last 30 or 40 years now, in almost all the core industrial democracies, you've seen the same tendencies at work, very much accelerated in the United States. A decline in voting turnout, a decline in party membership, and a decline in party identification. All the core indices show that people are withdrawing from representative politics. On the other side of that, you've got people withdrawing from, if they're in politics, withdrawing from the democratic side of it. In other words, politicians withdrawing into the state. So I'll give you an example. I mean, I'm sure you could think about examples that are appropriate to the United States context, but if I give you an example from the UK, in the run-up to the last general election in the United Kingdom, there was a coalition government of Liberals and Conservatives, the Conservatives the dominant partner. And in that coalition government, the Liberals were the most unpopular. In other words, they alienated most of their base by implementing the policies that they did. Come up to the election, the leader of that party, Nick Clegg, says, no government that is elected this year that doesn't include the Liberal Democrats as a coalition partner will have legitimacy. Now, he knew that if you like, a Liberal democide was coming. He knew that the party was about to be annihilated. He knew that they would end up with something less than 10% of the vote. So how could he possibly think that the Liberals were necessary for any government to have legitimacy? Well, the argument essentially was this. The Liberals might not win the popular vote. They might not win a lot of popular support, but they could be important allies within the parliamentary system itself. They could be allies within the state. They had enough MPs to be kingmakers, and they had enough people on select committees and other influential institutions to help get certain policies and ideas implemented. So you see this in a far more exaggerated fashion in so-called technocratic coalition governments that have taken place across Europe, where they implement austerity without having been elected. Obviously, Greece saw that, Italy saw that. There, I think, has been an ongoing struggle over whether Ireland will see the same type of thing. So that's something in the nature of the crisis. And I want to say that underlying that, it's not just one of the natural laws of politics that people just gradually become less and less interested in voting. This is something that's related to a very definite process, and it's a process in which the democratic capacities of the state have been deliberately, and as a matter of political strategy, closed down. And the name of the beast, if you like, is neoliberalism. When governments decided to embrace neoliberal politics and ideologies, what they effectively did was to essentially say that most of the state should be operated on the basis of market-like mechanisms. It should run like a business. And where it isn't run by businesses, in other words, privatized, it can be run with business involvement in the form of quasi-non-governmental organizations or whatever. Basically, anything other than a democratic body running your local service, whatever it happens to be, or running the National Health Service, you would get businesses in to run it. And there's the assumption under neoliberalism that businesses are the reasoning executive of the body politic. They know how to run everything. So no matter what it is, you can just get a guy from Prudential Insurance over to run your education system. They don't have to know anything about education. You can just put them in charge of the schools and they'll know what they're doing, apparently. This is neoliberalism. So one of the ways in which this affects people, of course, is that it reduces the scope of possible policies. If everything has to be run according to neoliberal logic, according to the logic of markets, and according to the fundamental premise that competition is the law of all social and economic and political life, and it's the role of government to reinforce that law, everything has to be about competition, and everything has to be mediated by market exchange, then, of course, where's the room for collective democratic solutions? Where's the room for welfare, for example? Where's the room for anything that's run on a collective basis? Well, of course, in the last 30 or 40 years, the groups of people that have been declining to turn out to vote have vastly disproportionately been those of the poorest income deciles, from the most working class and the most likely to be unemployed geographical areas. And those are the people, of course, who would usually vote for social democratic parties in Europe, and of course in the US they would vote for the Democratic Party. So the crisis of representative politics has been linked to a crisis of democracy, and it's also been linked, therefore, to a crisis of social democracy, because it's social democratic parties who have been disproportionately affected. They've been circumscribed in their ability to implement the policies that would give them any kind of legitimacy, that would give them a social base. So you get a situation in which growing number of people don't feel represented. But not only do they not feel represented by representative politics, they also don't feel represented in what you might call the representation of representation. In other words, the media. The media is supposed to give you a picture of the discussions and the debates that are happening among you. The media is supposed to reflect you. It's supposed to be telling you about the kinds of arguments that you're having in your house. And if you turn on Fox News or CNN or BBC or any of these other organizations, I don't think you really recognize, certainly most people from a very poor background don't recognize this as a debate that they're having. The debate that's being held in the mainstream media is the debate that's happening among policy elites, because policy elites are part of the same elite as media elites. They run in the same circles, they have the same conversations, and essentially, when someone like Jeremy Corbyn comes along, they all have the same reaction, which is, this guy's from Mars. We can't make sense of him. What's he talking about? The problems that he's talking about, they don't even understand as problems. They can't even acknowledge them as problems, let alone recognize the solutions he's talking about. So there's a growing number of people who are detached both from parliamentary representative politics and from the representation of representation in the media. Well, what does that do? It creates certain vacuums, if you want to use that language, in which previously marginal social forces and individuals can suddenly project themselves well beyond their actual social weight. This happened with Podemos, it happened with Syriza, it happened, I would say, with Bernie Sanders probably, and certainly it happened with Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn is somebody who comes from the hard left of the Labour Party, the hard left that has never been powerful in the Labour Party, never been anything but utterly marginal, and he comes to the leadership at a time when the left has never been weaker, when the organisation of the left has never been weaker, when numerically it has never been weaker, when its publications have never been read by fewer people, never been more dull. You know, essentially, he was able to do this not because of the overweening strength of the left and the rise of some sort of proto-Trotskyist movement, as a lot of the right wing in the UK would have you believe, but because of the weakness of the old political management. They were in crisis. And there was also, related to this, a social demographic shift. And you see this here, you've seen it in Latin America previously, and you've seen it in Southern Europe. Social demographic shift is such that younger people have been moving towards, not necessarily towards the left, but towards a more socially liberal position. You know, anti-racist, anti-sexist, supporting trans rights, this sort of stuff. And that generational shift was radicalized by the impact of the credit crunch and subsequent mutation into austerity. Why? Because one of the ways in which austerity struck was to hit at the apparatuses of so-called meritocracy. In this country, you're told that meritocracy exists because the education system exists. If you want to get somewhere, you've got to get yourself an education, right? In the UK, it's the same basic thing. Middle-class kids and working-class kids are told, you know, you can go to the top two if you work hard and get yourself through the higher education system. But of course, we all know that education, you know, it exists to produce hierarchy in a way, and it selects on the basis of properties that already belong to people of a middle-class background. But nonetheless, cutting access to higher education for working-class kids, as they did in the UK, and as has increasingly been the case across most of Europe, actually implementing policies, phase-based and market-based policies that are already well advanced in the US, had the effect of telling young people, essentially, you're not going to have much of a role in the future of this country or this economy. In fact, what's going to happen is you're going to be shut out of the housing market because you're not going to be able to afford to buy a house. You're not going to be able to afford to rent a house if you live in London. And what's more, you're going to be frozen out of the jobs market because when it comes to it, unemployment is going to affect you. It's young people who are going to be frozen out. So there was this social demographic shift that was radicalized by very definite processes that were taking place within the capitalist economy and in the capitalist sphere of politics. And they gravitated to Jeremy Corbyn. Why should they gravitate to some bearded old socialist who talks in a language that is certainly one with a great deal of moral clarity? I think it was a New Yorker writer who described Corbyn as having a priestly clarity. Well, I think you could say the same thing about Bernie Sanders in a way. And listening to him, he talks with an almost religious sort of emphasis in his voice and in his presentation, and certainly a religious moral simplicity and starkness. And that's very appealing to people who are sick to death of politicians, what do you call it, triangulating. Politicians who essentially say, my job is, I could take for granted that I've got X base, and my job is to win over a very slim layer of people in the middle, and therefore to try and find some sort of synthesis of left and right that will make them want to vote for me. On top of that, of course, you've got to triangulate between offering something to your base and offering something to your big business sponsors, as is increasingly the case in the UK as well. So essentially, Jeremy Corbyn comes along as somebody who is absolutely the anti-politician. He doesn't pretend to have charisma. He doesn't really have much of a personality. His hobbies include making jam and, gardening, all the rest of it. I mean, he's not a thriller. But he talks about austerity, and he talks about the housing crisis, and he talks about the horrible way in which we treat migrants. And people respond to that because actually he's talking about 21st century problems. The political class keep complaining, oh, he wants to take us back to the 70s and the 80s. No, he's talking about the here and now. It's you that are obsessed with the 70s or 80s. So then we have to think about this, because he did attract young people. He did win over the trade unions' bureaucracy, who were sick to death of going along with the political project of the Third Way that was leading to nothing but disaster for them, resulting in secular decline in their organization and numbers. And he did win over a certain cultural strata. He did win certain cultural arguments. And above all, he won, well, I wouldn't say above all, but on top of that, he also won a media battle. Now, this is important. He didn't win the media battle by fighting on the terms of the media. He didn't go out and say, well, how can I win the next news cycle? How can I win this headline? How can I get The Sun, the reactionary tabloid, on side? He didn't say that. He said, I'm going to go out there and tell it like it is. I'm going to tell it like it is in a way that rarely is said on the media. And the media are going to hate me for it, but the people who I want to vote for me are going to love me for it. And the more the media attacks me, the more they're going to love me. I mean, I don't know that he consciously thought all this out, but this is essentially the logic. So one of the assets that he was able to make use of was a very good social media campaign. And this tells us something about the changing nature of media and politics as well. Because it used to be back in the day that the big media corporations had an ideological monopoly. If you wanted to make an argument, make a case, you had to somehow get onto the news and be able to explain it to a mass audience. And usually you were kept to the margins. But now you've got social media, and actually, the potential audience for anything you say on the internet is potentially the entire internet. So you can suddenly reach a massive audience of people, even if your audience yesterday was 12 people in a basement. And that's essentially what happened to Jeremy Corbyn. He got a load of social media accounts that reached millions of people on a daily basis. And those millions were reached with arguments. It wasn't, that they were telling people anything they didn't know, but what they did was they took Jeremy Corbyn's ideas, his arguments, and basically packaged them in the most simple meme-like structure you could think of. Or, if the media attacked him and said, Jeremy Corbyn's no militant, he used to be on the protests and picket lines, they would dig up pictures of him on the protests and picket lines and say, yeah, they're right, and that's exactly why you want to vote for him, because he's not like any of these other politicians. They would turn a negative into a positive. So they took advantage of a crisis in parliamentary representation, a crisis in the Labour Party, in the traditional right-wing management of the Labour Party, and a crisis in the representation of representation, the media. And they did so in order to address crises in capitalism. So what are the prospects for success or failure? And this is something that's going to happen to any left-wing project, especially one that's oriented around a governing project. The idea of taking the institutions of government and trying to turn them to the ends of radical transformation. Because one of the first things you find when you look at the history of left-wing governments is how much they fail, how much they suck. They really try, and they immediately, everything just goes terribly badly wrong. There's very few examples of success. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, if you want to govern a capitalist economy, you have to get capitalists to invest. Well, how are you going to get people to invest in this economy? They're already hoarding tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars globally, right? There isn't that much profitable investment opportunity out there. How are you going to make them invest? You're going to go and tell them, well, what we're going to do is going to make you pay your taxes, I'm going to make you pay higher wages, and we're going to use all that money and invest it in the NHS and public services, and we're just going to care a little bit less about what you think. So how about investing for Britain, eh? It's not going to happen. They're going to say, you are pursuing an anti-business politics, and we are going to go on an investment strike. We're going to take our money out of the country, and we're going to put it somewhere else. Of course, often this is an empty threat, but that's the threat that they'll make. So trying to get businesses to invest in this climate, you have to somehow persuade them that your left-wing project is compatible with, commensurate with the interests of business. You have to be able to say to them, as Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell hope to do, and certainly I think Bernie Sanders would have hoped to do, and to some extent Syriza tried to do, you have to say to them, look, you've been trying neoliberalism for 40 years and it's come to this pass. Maybe you want to give us a go. What we'll do is we'll invest for the long term. We'll invest in technological development. We'll invest in an educated workforce, skilling up the workforce. We'll iron out some of the dysfunctions in the economy. It's better for you in the long run if you go along with this. You know, you can try that. Is business going to go along with that? Have they ever been known to think in the long term? Not in the US and not in the UK. You know. So, I mean, there's that problem that you face. But there's also the entrenched resistance of not just the media, but, I mean, in Corbyn's case, it would be his parliamentary so-called allies who would be organising against him. It would be the civil service as well, who like to keep things going as they are. So you've got all these sources of resistance against you, and Perry Anderson had a phrase for this. He talked about the way in which Labour governments had a propensity to become spotlight enclaves, surrounded by hostile forces. When you have conservative governments, you have an efficient circulation of power. They just seamlessly slot into the circulation of power. They're part of that whole system. Historically, when you had Labour governments, except for the Blair period, which was a sort of aberration, if you like, when you had Labour governments, you had essentially a sort of a blockage in the flow of power, and you had attempts to root around that government, to disempower it, and to stop it from implementing its policies. So there's inherently a contradiction in trying to implement, okay, understood, in trying to implement a radical left program within a capitalist state. You're trying to transition to something like not socialism, but a slightly less capitalist economy, slightly more socialized spaces, you know, and you're going to face all this resistance. Well, this brings us to the final question and the final problem, and that's the problem of the state. What is the state? We talk about the state. Right-wingers in this country, I know, have a very sort of supposedly radical anti-state doctrine. They actually have an anti-government doctrine. And what they or rather, to be more precise, they have an anti-welfare, anti-public services doctrine. They're all in favor of things like police and army and repressive state interventions. They're all in favor of prisons most of the time, unless you're talking about libertarians. This leaves us with the question of what the state actually is. In the past, we would have talked about the state as a machinery of repression. You know, that was the classical left-wing analysis. Well, can you really talk about it like that in that simple way when the state also includes welfare functions, when it also includes civil society functions, when it has representative institutions wherein, they're not, they don't give you tremendous amounts of power, but you can achieve something, you can do something. Depending on where you are, of course. Is that sufficient? Well, it seems to me that we could think about the state not as a thing, not as an it. We could overcome the reification of the state as an instrument that is in the hands of the ruling class or whatever, but rather see the state more as a field of power and a field of contest and a field of struggle. And this is something that I think you saw with the I mean, it's rather different here because the field of the state is much more heavily monopolized by the dominant classes, the dominant social forces. But certainly to some extent in the UK, for example, you can talk about resistances that have been built in within the state over the years. Resistances in the form of trade union organization, public sector trade unions, resistances in the form of local councils that have tried to stop various policies from being implemented, that have tried to support liberation movements, tried to support gay rights and all the rest of it. In the UK, a big part of the neoliberal struggle against democracy, and I don't know exactly how this pans out in the US, I could talk about the context of New York in the 70s, but in the UK, big part of the struggle to implement neoliberalism was to crush local democracy. It was to crush the spaces within which the radical left and the trade unions and public sector organizations had been able to develop a counterpower against the traditional domination of the state by the ruling class. It didn't mean that they were able to take over the state. It didn't mean that the state suddenly was at their disposal. It just meant that within the state there were certain spaces within which they could exercise a degree of power and a degree of democratic pressure. And that's the way in which I would suggest we think about these projects for left-wing struggle within the state. It's something that has to take place on two levels. It has to take place within civil society, certainly. It has to take place in a way of organizing people who have not previously been organized, getting people involved in trade unions if they're in precarious sectors of the economy, getting people to get involved in housing organizations if they're faced with gentrification, getting people organized around anti-racist organization if they're being beaten up by the police, and so on and so on and so on. This is what the Labour Party's hundreds of thousands of members should be spending their time doing, rather than just going knocking doors for various candidates. Organising the people, organising the class, if you like. Well, the other side of that, of course, is that that has to support a transformative agenda within the state, not because the state is the best terrain in which we can fight, but because the state is the terrain in which the politics of the nation are condensed and concentrated, and in which people formulate their idea of what is possible, what it is possible to do. And because, in fact, if you do fight within the state, you might actually get some of what you want. You won't get everything, but you might get some of what you want. And you might be able to use the power of office to strengthen and support the social forces that will back your agenda. So that's the sort of general sort of idea of transition that I wanted to present to you today, based on the experience of Jeremy Corbyn and of similar movements across Europe. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Peter, are you ready?
Sure. Well, I'm quite glad that Richard lost the coin toss and had to go first, because I think that was a good. All right, where I don't know where it belongs here.
Sounds good.
All right, and I'm gonna have to get up and draw on the board for a second later, but I'll try to make sure I speak my points into the mic while in between doing that. So I think this is a good lead into what I'm going to talk about, even though it seems very different in some ways, because what Richard has identified is the crisis that capitalism presently finds itself in, cultural, political, and economic. And he started to lay out some of the elements of putting together a political force that can actually build something different and better. I wish I could do more to complete that part of the picture. Unfortunately, this may end up sounding sort of like the joke from the South Park TV show, where step one is irresolvable crisis of capitalism, step two is a bunch of question marks, and step three is communism. It's invariably is going to have a bit of that structure. But I do think it's important to recognize capitalism in crisis. As a Marxist, it shouldn't be surprising that I'm here to tell you that capitalism is in crisis. Conveniently, I think it has been periodically in crisis for its entire history, so that always is a good thing you can say to audiences. But the question is then, how is the crisis resolved, and what happens next? And my book is attempted as sort of a thought experiment, a speculative move, not to go to the immediate political questions, which unfortunately I don't have ideal answers to. But I was looking at one of the writers who's influenced me in this work earlier today, And since we're in a place, we're being hosted by people that study Europe and the EU, and Richard is European, I figured the European sociologist Wolfgang Streeck, who influenced me in writing this book, was a good starting point, who has written about the current crisis of capitalism in many of the same terms that Richard just sort of laid out. And he refers to it in a recent article in New Left Review as a prejudice that capitalism as a historical epoch will end only when a new, better society is in sight and a revolutionary subject ready to implement it for the advancement of mankind is available. He says neither a utopian vision of an alternative future nor superhuman foresight should be required to validate the claim that capitalism is facing its Götterdämmerung, its end times. And I certainly don't have superhuman foresight. I do think a bit of vision of the alternative future, however, can be useful for us in guiding both sort of inspiring us, maybe scaring us, and giving us some larger structure in which our immediate political tasks are embedded. This poses, again, a problem for me as a Marxist because, as Richard said, Marx didn't like blueprints. I don't really like them either. He cautioned against writing recipes for the kitchens of the future. And so how do we talk about, the end of capitalism or life after capitalism, as in the subtitle of my book, without pretending to have a blueprint, without being like those futurist authors that you see in airport bookstores that are telling you, how the world is going to be in 20 years. And so I start from the proposition that capitalism, as we understand it, is going to come to an end sooner or later, and looking more like sooner, but again, I can't say exactly when. And something else will succeed it, but that's not necessarily something I would call socialism or something I would call good or something I would call better than capitalism. It's just not what we think of as capitalism. And going back again to Wolfgang Streeck, who tried to define, how would we know if capitalism had ended? What even is capitalism? I mean, it's one thing to have a sort of like textbook definition, but real societies are complicated. What are the elements that are important? And he defines it as a modern society that secures its collective reproduction as an unintended side effect of individually rational, competitive profit maximization in pursuit of capital accumulation through a labor process combining privately owned capital with commodified labor power. Now, that last part, the privately owned capital and commodified labor power, was sort of the pin I wanted to pull out of this structure in thinking about alternatives to capitalism. Because one of the starting points, the starting point that I ended up using in this book, is a genre that has flowered again in recent years, as it has periodically over the history of capitalism, which is the question of automation, robotization, algorithms, all the various ways in which capitalism uses new technologies to replace human labor. And throughout the history of capitalism, that drive, that constant drive to increase productivity, has produced sort of two opposed trains of thought, particularly on the left. One is the hopeful one that says these are possibly the sources of bounty and wealth and leisure for all of us if we could harness these technologies in a different form of society. Alternately, this holds out the prospect of reducing us all to misery and unemployment if we do not control how these technologies are implemented. And, so now there's a new wave of books that and articles that you'll see saying the robots are coming, they're going to computerize everything, and then you get various, some people will say, well, that's not true, you can't really, there's plenty of human labor and you can't automate everything. Some, bourgeois economists will say, well, the new jobs will always appear to make up for the old ones, and so we don't have to worry about this, and everything will just get better naturally. Some people on the left will say, really, we should be talking about aggregate demand. We should be talking about stimulus and public investment, and this is all just a distraction. And I do, again, I'm not a futurist. I'm not trying to write the recipes for the kitchens of the future, and so I don't want to pretend that this sort of total automation of human labor is any more inevitable now than it has ever been since, in U.S. folklore, since the days when John Henry, the steel-driving man, tried to race against steam power and dropped dead. It's an anxiety as old as industrial capitalism. However, the dream of harnessing technology to liberate humanity is also as old as the anti-capitalist movements of the socialist and Marxist left. And so I begin this thought experiment with the idea of, okay, what if it were possible? And this sort of dream comes out of the intersection of my interest in Marxism and my interest in science fiction. The starting point was partly Karl Marx and it was partly Star Trek. What if we had these, for anyone who's seen that show, replicators that make anything at the push of a button, free energy created by antimatter explosions, all this kind of stuff. That world, in a lot of ways, was this sort of liberal idea of a communist society, a post-scarcity communist society. And I wanted to take that sort of hopeful vision and do something with it, but then I also wanted to put the politics back into it. The idea that these technical preconditions don't guarantee us any particular form of society. You can have the 1% and the 99%, even with the technology of the Star Trek future, which is another way of saying something that's also a very old idea in the socialist tradition. The German Marxist Rosa Luxemburg put it as that we face the choice between moving into socialism or regressing into barbarism. Capitalism will become something else, but it's not necessarily better than what we have now, and it all depends on the outcome of a political struggle. And so the book is an attempt to speculate about that, and also to talk about something else that intersects with the class struggle dynamic and the technological dynamic that I just described, which is the ecological crisis that faces both capitalism and any system that could conceivably succeed it. And so this is where I'm going to try to step to the board quickly. This won't be that easy to see for a lot of people in the room, but don't worry, I'll walk you through this, because there's a very rigid kind of 2x2 structure that animates the four futures of the title that I try to imagine in the book. So, as I've said, automation is sort of the premise. Even though I don't think it's true or desirable that you can ever completely eliminate human labor, I sort of take the extreme assumptions so that I can do the thought experiment. So then there are two other axes of variation, two other questions that arise. So the first one is the axis of ecology, what I call the axis of ecology, which has scarcity on your left end and abundance on the right end. And this is climate change. This is the reduction of farmable and habitable land. This is water scarcity. This is scarcity of other natural resources. This question of, even if we did have the machines to be able to make everything we need without human labor, the Earth can't necessarily support arbitrarily high standards of living for arbitrarily large numbers of people. And that raises a political question that's distinct from the labor question. So that's axis number one. The second axis is class struggle, as I suggested before, or more broadly, the political dimension that is so often missing from discussions about alternative forms of society and where we go from here. So there you have at the top what I am calling broadly a society of hierarchy. In other words, the kind of society we live in now, in which power and resources are monopolized by a small elite of the sort that Richard was just talking about in the context of American and UK politics. At the bottom is equality, which is one of the basic principles that has animated socialist and left movements forever. The idea that however much we have or don't have, however high a standard of living we can have in the future, that we can work that out in an egalitarian and democratic way, rather than having it decided for us by elites. And this leads us to the four futures that are just the 2x2 grid. So I start in the book with the most utopian future, the combination of equality and abundance, which is what I call communism, using the term that's sometimes associated with the Marxist tradition, where people will sometimes say, well, there's socialism, which is where we take control of the means of production, we overthrow the capitalist class, we live in, we have some kind of more equal society. But the long run goal is not just to reallocate resources or even just to democratically take control of production, but to liberate people from the need to do involuntary labor at all. which is, of course, the dream of technological abundance. And so if you have those technologies and you have found ways to transcend the ecological problem, to move to renewable energy, to clean up the effects of climate change and mitigate them, to find better ways of using the resources of the earth, then you get into that box, the communist box. And so, as I do in all of the four futures, I use examples from science fiction as well as examples from social science and current events and current theory in order to, on the one hand, examine things that I think are relevant to the politics of today, and then secondly, to extrapolate that forward into a society in which that becomes the main question. And in this society, of course, the immediate question is, well, what are the problems? Well, you've just wished them all away. Isn't this perfection? Isn't this the end of history? And on the other side, some people have sort of said this to me in a darker way. Well, wouldn't life lose all meaning? What would we do without all these obstacles that we run up against in our society? And I say that in some ways, removing capitalism, that relationship between capital and labor, removing that master hierarchy of money, unleashes far more interesting and more complicated conflicts and difficulties that have to do with hierarchies that can still exist, prejudices that can still exist, conflicts that can still exist, but they're not all reducible to money. And so here I talk a bit about the kind of thing Richard was saying about the things that happen in the interstices of our society that point somewhere else. So people will sometimes say, well, we already have sort of these communist institutions where people come together voluntarily in order to do something for a reason that's not about money. You know, that could be a community garden, it could be Wikipedia, you know, it could be, you know, the left wing of the sort of maker movement of people with 3D printers in their garages. And then I look at that and say, and look at things like Wikipedia, which on the one hand is this very utopian thing, but on the other hand is full of weird backstabbing cliques and misogyny and all kinds of like, you know, faction fighting and things that aren't reducible to it, you know, whether it's a capitalist institution or not. However, those kinds of problems, these various kinds of problems that arise outside of the hierarchy of money and capital and labor are the problems I would rather have. And so that's the sort of vision I want to project of a society that's preferable to the one we have, but not just a cartoon utopia with no problems. And so from there, I build the problems back in certain ways, right? So moving in, you know, staying with the abundance assumption, you move into where I actually started this whole project, which is what if you take that Star Trek society and try to turn it into a class society? In a world where you don't need human labor to make things, what is the economy based around? And what it's based around, I argue, is some form of rent. And so this becomes the future I refer to as rentism, starting with the concept of rent as it is traditionally understood, meaning rent on land, for example, that you can own something and make money from it without doing anything with it. You don't hire labor, you don't produce things, you just own something and you charge for access to it. So in the case of land, the same house is worth more in, you know, you can charge more rent in Boston than you can in Western Massachusetts somewhere because the land is more valuable and whoever owns it just extracts that stream of rents. But what I want to belabor in this chapter is that the increasing number of different kinds of property now take that form in 21st century economies, in particular through the form of intellectual property. Things like patents and copyrights, things that basically predict patterns. It costs virtually nothing to make a copy of a digital movie file, and yet you're supposed to pay money to whoever owns the rights to that file. It can cost virtually nothing to make a lot of life-saving medicines, but the companies that own those patents extract huge amounts of money, charging for access to them. And so one way I see out of the impasse of capitalism is to virtualize more and more of the economy in that way. And of course, this creates all kinds of other contradictions and problems in terms of how do people earn money to pay for things, if there aren't any jobs, what jobs would exist in terms of enforcing copyrights, making new patterns, advertising them, that sort of thing. How would you deal with the kind of underconsumption and economic stagnation problems that we see in a lot of advanced capitalist economies now and that would only intensify in a system like this? That's the sort of, those are the key themes that chapter turns on. So then from there, I take out the abundance assumption and put the ecological question first and foremost and say, first of all, what happens if we can get to sort of an egalitarian eco-socialist future where climate change, resource scarcity, these ecological devastation are huge problems, but we at least have an egalitarian way of solving them. And here, old debates about socialist economic planning and come back, but in a sort of a different way. Those debates in the 20th century often were about how do you organize labor? How do you organize who does what and who does the bad jobs? If you assume the sort of prevalence of labor-saving technology, it becomes more of a problem of planning consumption. How do you make sure people don't take more than is supportable, that they don't impose a burden on the earth that makes things worse for everyone else? And so then some of these old debates about both the role of economic planning and even the role of something like markets, once you've separated them from their capitalist context, can have a role, because as I argue here, the market, even though the left likes to talk about the market as though it's one of the essential things that are wrong with capitalism, because in capitalism it creates inequality and unfairness, but that's primarily because in capitalism the people who come into the market have such widely different endowments of resources and therefore more power. It's a democracy of $1, one vote in the market. And so in a society which you didn't have that, where we had equal amounts of ecological credits or whatever, those problems might not arise. So that chapter is about that, and it's about environmentalism and ecology, and about also the way in which we think about going forward what a left environmentalism means. You know, there are some Greens who will say, you know, sort of talk in a way of like, we have to reduce our footprint, the load we place on the earth, we have to sort of withdraw from nature and stop mucking it up. Whereas I look at it in the sort of anthropocentric sense that we are so deeply immersed in making and remaking nature that we're going to have to intensify that process going forward and hopefully do it in a way that's responsible and that's democratic and that's egalitarian, rather than a handful of crazy geoengineering Silicon Valley venture capitalists, which is the other way that it could happen. So finally we get to square number 4, hierarchy and scarcity, and this is where it gets like it turns into a dystopian Hollywood movie. Because here the central problematic I want to get at, getting back again, when I talked about what is capitalism, core to it is that labor process combining privately owned capital with commodified labor power. And what that dynamic creates is a relationship of mutual dependence between workers and capitalists. The workers need the capitalists because they have no other way to earn money. They don't have access to the means of production. The capitalists need the workers because who else is going to run the factories, run the shops, make the commodities on which their profit depends? The less that you need lots of workers in production, the less that relationship of mutual interdependence holds. Now, in a perfectly abundant society, that can lead into the rentist scenario I described, which is one where sort of communism is possible, but as a way of maintaining their social power, the rich could have create a new virtualized form of capitalist property relations. But if the ecological crisis is really severe, then this doesn't work because it requires lowering the standards of living of the ruling class themselves. And so here the situation becomes, you just have pools of what are, from the standpoint of the rich, surplus populations. The people who get warehoused in prisons, warehoused in refugee camps, kept out of the network of private islands and gated communities that are defended by surveillance systems and drones and robots and all the rest of it. And the ultimate endpoint of this is, I call this fourth future exterminism. And it's called that because the ultimate endpoint of this is these dangerous surplus populations, from the standpoint of the rich, you just want to get rid of them, which doesn't necessarily mean some recapitulation of the final solution. It can just mean letting people die of preventable diseases, letting people die of climate change-caused natural disasters. It can mean, by neglect, essentially, isolating the poor and allowing them to suffer while a small number of people are able to continue to enjoy something like the advanced societies that the rich enjoy in the rich countries today. So that's sort of where I end things, and then try to come back on a slightly more positive note and say, again, the point is not to predict any of these futures, but to draw a matrix of possibilities, and furthermore to insist that on one level all of these futures are happening now, but that which parts we draw out and which we suppress are in many ways up to us and to the kinds of political struggles that Richard was talking about, and to the kind of political movements that will be necessary to come up with some alternative to the moribund politics that we've been experiencing for basically my whole life. So I'll leave it at that and see where we want to go from there.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so I'm going to use my powers as moderator to ask a couple questions of the speakers just to get the ball rolling, and then we'll start taking questions from the audience. All right, so Richard, I'll ping you first. In the US, we all were very excited about Bernie Sanders this year, or at least I was. But, I mean, if we compare a candidate like Sanders and Corbyn, we can clearly see Corbyn is far to the left of Sanders, and a different kind of candidate all around. However, at the same time, I think there are some interesting parallels between the two candidates. And I wonder, your book ends on a somewhat, I wouldn't say dour note, but it's not super optimistic about where things are going in the left. But I wonder if you might speculate a bit on sort of what lessons the U.S. left might draw from kind of the strange Corbyn experience happening in the U.K. And Peter, I'll just say my questions for you now. First, I thought it might be nice for you just to talk a little bit more about why you chose models from speculative fiction or science fiction, and what kind of why you chose them instead of a lot of the sort of burgeoning left literature out there now, thinking about, some of it is futurist, but also just thinking about sort of solutions and visions. And kind of related to that, if you could just sort of, it's a speculative question too, but if you just talk a little bit about how a thought experiment like this might actually be used to build kind of social movements on the ground. Sort of what is the value of it for people out there, particularly in the sort of post-Bernie moment when people are thinking about, okay, what next? Where do we go from here? What kinds of projects do we want to get going?
To answer the question is to talk a little bit about pessimism. In introducing me, you mentioned the magazine that I edit, or co-edit. I'm one of the editors of Salvage magazine. And we've sort of distinguished ourselves and defined ourselves in a way as a kind of pessimistic publication. And by pessimism, what we mean to do is organize a kind of counter-pressure, a cultural counter-pressure against the default left optimism and bad hope, which always results in disillusionment and demoralization and demobilization. Because there's a tendency to think that each new thing, each new movement, each new political happening is going to be the thing that's going to change everything around and suddenly make the left relevant and wildly popular. But if you look concretely and realistically about the situation of the left in the UK and US today, probably much more so in the US, to be honest, but in different ways and different patterns, the historical legacy is one that you should be pessimistic about. It's realistic to be pessimistic because the balance of forces is stacked heavily against you. It's stacked against you in the sense that the US has never had a Labour Party, so it's never had an independent working class party. The dominant parties have always been big business parties. And one of them, the Liberal one, has historically been the white supremacist party. So, you know, I mean, there's a lot to be pessimistic about. But there's also a sense that we need to understand the scale of the challenge that we're up against. So what we're up against here is a generation of work. If we want a viable, habitable left, a left that anybody would want to belong to, and could then become a means of struggle, successful struggle, winning things, of actually getting change, it would take a generation of work. It would take rebuilding the infrastructure of an organized labor movement in the parts of the economy where labor is most precarious, most politically weak, finding it most difficult to get any kind of wage increase and so on. Migrant workers would be a good place to start in the US, obviously. It's going to take the repoliticization of growing layers of people. Many of whom just don't, because they don't vote, they often feel like they've dropped out of politics. They think that politics has nothing to do with them. To get them engaged in politics on a different level. And it would also require building up democratic capacities as against the domination of your political system by, Google and Goldman Sachs and all the rest of them. So that's a long-term project, and one that's going to be incredibly difficult. And you're going to see a lot more defeats, such as Sanders experienced. The field will always be tilted against you. It will always be structured against you having any chance of success, and it will never be fair. So going around, complaining about how unfair it is just going to be missing the point entirely. It's structurally unfair. It's supposed to be. They don't like you. They don't want you in power. So that would be my point about that. So the question I have, and it's not a question I know the answer to, but I'll leave it at this, is what's going to come out of Sanders' campaign? What's going to come out of the Sandinistas? Because you had this huge cultural and political moment where so many millions of people were politicized. But if all that comes out of it is a nice series of memories and maybe the scars of defeat and bitterness with the Democratic Party, that's not very much. What you want is something that can be perpetuated and sustained, something that can be institutionalized, something that you can take forward and use again and again and again to your advantage.
So your question is for me, why use speculative fiction in an exercise like this? Part of it is that in a context where, as I agree with Richard, that a certain amount of rational pessimism is necessary. I also think it's necessary to hold on to some kind of vision of how things could be different. And I think speculative fictions are very good at doing that, at allowing us to imagine that in a way that's not just dry theory, but that actually tries to bring to life other types of societies. The deeper reason why I specifically relied on fiction in a work that's about the future has to do, again, with this question of not writing blueprints and not writing recipes for the kitchens of the future. Partly the reason to not do that is because they never turn out the way that you predicted. But the deeper reason than that is that there is actually an inherent contradiction between making confident predictions of the future and holding on to the version of emancipatory socialism that I do, which is one that says the future must be made democratically together by us in the process of political struggle. And you can't believe that and also believe that you already know how things are going to turn out, because then you don't really believe in the democratic emancipatory struggle. And so the way I try to get around that is by using fictions, using stories, not as how things will be, but as here are things happening now, and here's where you could possibly follow that imaginatively. And that I hope that, and so to go again to what is the value of a thought experiment like this, in some ways, I'm a very traditional kind of socialist and Marxist, and a lot of the ideas in this book are not especially novel. They're just presented and organized in a somewhat different way. And so part of the idea for me is to draw, using this conceptual structure that I came up with, is to draw together this idea of, okay, how do, our struggles over our voluntary, collective, open source projects fit into the larger whole? How does environmental struggle, fit into the larger whole? How does, the battles over intellectual property fit in? How does struggles against militarism and imperialism and police violence fit into the whole? And so I want to knit all those things together in a way that takes seriously their specificity and their particularity, but then tries to draw them together again into a vision, not of exactly where we go from here and how we build a follow-up to the Sanders campaign or any of that, but some somewhat broader vision of what is it that potentially unites us.
Okay, great. So I will sort of point to you in the audience. Please try to keep your question or comment brief, because I imagine there are a lot of people who want to have their voice heard. And there's a microphone. There are two microphones. So wait for the microphone, or perhaps you want to move toward the microphone, if that's easier. Okay, so who would like to go first? Yes, right in the front.
Yes, thank you both very much for your comments and moderation as well. My question is, how do we get there from here? Reform, and I hear that more from one of you than from the other. From Richard, reform or revolution, or is reform revolution? Is it sort of abrupt change, or is it incremental? And I say that because it seems to me that often the left has had very good ideas, and Richard said that, in power it doesn't get very far, et cetera. But even out of power, if you look at major changes in our lives at different junctures, it has been, even though the left has not necessarily been in power, look at the post-war period, where in fact you saw increase in democracy, social democracy, welfare, and all of that. So we're really talking about a certain moment in time, sort of the beginning of neoliberalism. And then my question is it possible that, and I think both of you are talking about social movements, is it possible that social movements can essentially put pressure in a way and circulate new ideas in a way that you get change without necessarily the kind of Marxian revolution that is utopian? And I say this because I was just in Lisbon on a panel with Wolfgang Streeck, where we were talking about democracy. And he has a very pessimistic view, and he basically used the image of a train hurtling into the station. I share his analysis, but then said, when I was asked from someone in the audience, I said, but I actually see this as, I'm hoping that the conductor will actually see that the station is coming up fast. And we'll try to apply the brakes. We'll put on new brake pads. We'll find that that can shunt into another rail at the last minute. And so my question for you is, how do you see, or both of you, how do you see change occurring? Is it just social movements, et cetera? But if we talk social movements, we've got them out there. They're called the radical right and the rise of populism. So can we have an optimistic view here? Of sort of moving forward, or is there no such optimism?
How do you want to do it? Just come back. I can go.
That's fine. I'll go quickly. My brief answer to that is that I don't think you have to choose between reform and revolution, but you have to think concretely about the kinds of agencies that you need to convoke in order to achieve both. So if you want to talk about, I should say, when I was reflecting on the state, I'm influenced very much by Nikos Palantzas and the idea that one needs a dual strategy, one of traversing the state, but also building up direct democracy on the ground. And I think that would be an appropriate way to think about political strategy in the 21st century, given the way the state has built itself into the fabric of everyday life. It's not a minimal sort of night watchman state anymore, so that's not feasible just to encircle it. But I do think that at some point one would need a rupture with the existing social, political, and economic structures and order, and that there would be a fight, and that the existing ruling class would put up a fight, and the struggle would become a revolutionary one. So the real question is, you talked about social movements. Is that the format in which we can build something up? Well, that's become a bit of a cliche, actually, in today's sort of situation. Corbyn talks about the Labour Party becoming a social movement. It's rubbish. Parties are not social movements. Social movements cannot be wished into existence. Social movements emerge around the problem of the reproduction of a given social relationship when it becomes problematic, when it becomes politicized, whether it's sexism, whether it's patriarchy or white supremacy or capitalism or something else. And when you have social movements, then you can relate to them. So my answer to that would be, let's not fetishize the idea of social movements. Where movements arise, it's the job of good radical left political parties to incorporate them, to take in their critique, their ideas, their forms of organization and experience, and condense them and concentrate them at the level of political organization and give them that sort of expression, and hopefully to demonstrate that they can be useful to the movements. But sometimes you just have to have what one of the eminence gris's of the international socialist tradition used to call revolutionary patience. In other words, sometimes you just have to sit on your hands and wait and see.
Yeah, I mean, I think my view is basically the same as Richard's. I should say, maybe it was not as clear in the talk as it is in some places, I think, in the book, that I'm not at all, I don't diminish the needs for reform and day-to-day struggles for reform. And in fact, I take the same view that the reformist and revolutionary approaches or traditions can't really be separated easily. And I talk some in the book about both older ideas like shorter hours and higher wages, and also sort of newer ideas like the universal basic income, and how things like that might point both in the direction of intensifying some of the trends toward automation that we see, and also of opening up those spaces for non-capitalist collective activity. At the same time, I agree with Richard that the moments of rupture do arrive, the moments of great conflict come when the ruling class is no longer content to allow you to sort of build communism around their ears. And that's where I think, to me, the lesson of the social democrats of the 20th century was not that they were wrong to win the welfare state or win the reforms that they did, but that they were fundamentally not prepared for and did not have the movements that would be prepared for the tensions and crises that ultimately were resolved in a right-wing neoliberal direction. And so it's the attempt to think those two projects together, which is a very difficult one, but I think the one, all these questions of how do we consolidate social movements into things that can contest political and state power, how do we work through all these immediate questions while also thinking in a bigger sense about the crises that our victories will inevitably produce. That to me is one of the really tricky strategic problems for the left today.
Okay, great. I think I'm going to take like 3 questions together, and then the speakers can answer them how they see fit. So the gentleman here in the plaid shirt.
Peter just mentioned what I was going to ask about, which is universal basic incomes. I was wondering if you could talk about that. If we're having increasing automation and less work to go around, do you think the left should be focusing on universal basic income? I know it's being talked about in Europe actually as policy, but do you foresee actual movement on the ground, like in the U.S., this being feasible in the near future?
All right. A young lady here in the front.
Thanks. I also had a question about the role of globalization in building a viable left movement, and sort of how partnerships between the global north and global south could work.
Great. And one more gentleman with the glasses, blue shirt, right there. Yeah.
My question is about the sort of entrenchment of neoliberal institutions. Kind of looking back at the Syriza moment after the plebiscite where the Greek people said that they didn't want to go further into austerity with the EU. And then Tsipras went into meetings and he came out and he had agreed to more austerities, and he looked in pictures like he had been beaten with a cudgel. And so I'm wondering, how can we approach these institutions that seem like they have so much more power than we can even imagine, that they can even sort of trump a popular vote?
Okay. Sure, do you want to go first?
Sure. Quickly on universal basic incomes, it is very much a theme that is beginning to gain ground in the UK. I think it's going to become... It's always been a little bit controversial because there's the critique that it can lend itself to neoliberal solutions, and there is a neoliberal variant of it. But it is gaining ground because there's a growing social layer of people whom we're inclined to call the precariat. I don't think that's a very precise designation, but there's certainly a layer of people who are insecure in their work, who are not paid enough, and for whom especially if you're a petty bourgeois scribe like me, and your income is irregular, then a universal basic income would be to provide a degree of stability for me and quite a lot of people. So I think it's becoming a thing. Globalization. I think that there used to be a sort of even a fashionable idea that we could have transnational alliances, and I would I would like us to think about, I mean, certainly in the anti-capitalist movement, the moments around Seattle and afterwards, it was possible to talk about this, and there were various international forums. That seems to have gone into abeyance as politics has turned more inward. And certainly, maybe we will have to think about imaginative ways of restoring that. Certainly, the global project of corporations hasn't stopped. We've seen that with the various trade deals. And the right-wing answer to that, which is isolationist in a sense, in another sense chauvinist and bigoted and militaristic, is not going to be an answer that benefits working people. I mean, it certainly won't benefit working people in America if you cut off relations with China, because you're not going to have as much cheap goods to buy. You'll have a massive loss in the value of your income. But there must be an internationalist alternative to the nationalist right. So I'm with you. I'm just not sure how we materialize that, how we turn it into something. It's similar dilemma occurs whenever there's a war or an issue of where there's a humanitarian crisis, like in Syria. I would love to be able to say that we had a version of the international brigades today, or something like that, where we didn't have to sort of rely on the idea of the US military going in and acting like Superman. You know, we're going to go in there and save you. And we have these magical beliefs in the powers of military to solve everything. I would like to believe that we could form international coalitions, a coalition of the willing, if you like. But it's very difficult to materialize that. It's very difficult to turn that into something real. Lastly, entrenchment of neoliberal institutions. Look, I think it's important to say this about Syriza. Two things. Number one, a big part of their leadership had no intention of fighting. All right? A big part of their leadership was so pro-European that their understanding of the situation was, we get elected, we demonstrate our respectability as a centre-left party, we try and negotiate for terms, we take the terms that we're given, right? That was their strategy. There was another part of the leadership that really did want to fight, and they just didn't know how they were going to fight. They thought, you know, if they demonstrate enough moral capital, if they put enough pressure on, then the EU would start to cave. The second thing that I have to bear in mind is the Greek left was in the most powerless position you can imagine for an elected government. Not only was it a radical left government and thus surrounded by hostile forces within its own country, but it was if you like, a peripheral country within an imperialist structure of the European Union. In other words, the role of the Greek economy was to buy German goods and to run up debt, right? And then to pay for the crisis of the Eurozone when things went wrong. Well, that meant that there was a tremendous amount of political power that came with that came with the sort of dominance of the German economy within the whole system, so that it wasn't just the Greek government that was ruling, it was also the European Central Bank that was ruling, it was also the financial ministers of the Eurozone that were ruling. It was also the European presidency that was ruling, it was also the IMF that was ruling. So there's a whole series of institutions, interlocking institutions, not to mention private corporate power, that had no relationship to anything elected. And you know, when leaders of the EU came out and said, as Jean-Claude Juncker did, and as Wolfgang Schäuble did, you can't reverse an agreement by democratic verdict. They meant it. The European Union is a rules-based club for rich men. Rich women too sometimes, but mostly rich men, right? And it is essentially structured against any kind of democratic project. But if you're at the bottom of that, as opposed to, say, if you're in Britain, if you were a Corbyn-led government in Britain, which is a powerful imperialist state, got a lot of clout in the world, still hanging on to American coattails, but basically, you know, still got some sort of power. You know, they just had no chance against that overwhelming force against them. The only chance they had was to take a gamble on getting out of the European Union, getting out of the Eurozone, and then starting up again by making alliances with Russia and third world countries. And that would have been a huge gamble to take. So that's just by way of saying that sometimes, I mean, it's not just about neoliberal institutions, it's about the power of capital and its political organization. And sometimes, you know, unless you're willing to take losses, unless you're willing to lose the advantages and benefits of capitalism, you're not going to get the benefits of any alternative.
So yeah, to start at the end, the Syriza stuff is much more Richard's area of expertise than mine. I'll just add that in terms of the internal divisions that were going on there's definitely a period of time when Jacobin was sort of became an English language mouthpiece for the left wing of Syriza. So you can go back and read a lot of those articles if you want to see how that was unfolding while all of this was going on, at least from the left wing, more anti-EU perspective. This question of globalization, I mean, I agree. This question of how you materialize global movements is sort of like how do you materialize them even nationally is not an easy question to answer. In terms of the stuff I was talking about from my book, I would say you can sort of see the threads that, in the various themes I talk about where there's elements of at least global social movements, if not necessarily fully, not global political parties exactly, but, you can look at, the issues of intellectual property and sharing of information are very much transnational, I was just thinking of the example of the woman from, I think, Kazakhstan who started the website that basically gives people, democratizes access to academic research for people around the world, especially in poor countries that can't pay exorbitant fees for access through or don't have access to university libraries. That kind of stuff draws in, people globally. These questions of ecology, obviously the ecological crisis is global, and the making connections between how it affects the people in the poorest countries versus, the way it's affecting people in North Dakota right now who are fighting over the pipeline there. That's something where you can see the threads of it, and there's a long way to go to draw it together. But, and also this question of like how you connect questions of militarism and imperialism to militarization that happens at home. I think some of the leading, sort of more advanced elements, in movements like Black Lives Matter have made those connections with war, with things like the occupation of Palestine even, which, was very controversial among some liberals who had otherwise been supportive. So it's like you can see movements beginning to think globally, even if we haven't quite figured out how to organize globally. On basic income, I also basically agree with Richard's point. I would say my positive pitch for basic income is that not only is it very important as a way of supporting people with precarious incomes, but it also pushes towards something that, as a matter of principle, I think is important, which is that I come from sort of an anti-work socialist tradition, which says that getting us less dependent upon doing a job for somebody, whether that's a government job or a private job, that is an important socialist principle, especially today when so many people are doing work that is useful or destructive only because they need a paycheck. And so the basic income is a positive value purely for that reason. But yes, I would also warn, there is this sort of left-right alliance on the basic income, which can in certain tactical situations be valuable. And I think there's sometimes this almost conspiratorial strain on the left that says, well, if there's any capitals for the basic income, it must all just be a plot and we should oppose it. But there is definitely the right-wing version of basic income that wants to liquidate things like the rights to healthcare, education, housing in ways that I think are totally untenable and would make things worse. So that my basic starting point with basic income is we have to fight for a basic income that does not make things worse for large segments of the working class, which is what some of the right-wing versions of it would do.
Okay, great. You with the glasses, and you with the blue shirt, and then you with the hat. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to. I was wondering if you could speak to. Could you speak to the relationship between the socialist movement and identity politics? Because identity politics is something that originated on the progressive left. Maybe it's just me, but I feel like it's kind of been hijacked recently by campaigns like Hillary Clinton, but possibly others as well. Sure.
Can you repeat your question, please?
Okay, could you please speak to the relationship between the socialist movement and identity politics, which I think was a movement that originated on the left and has probably been hijacked, especially recently, by figures like Hillary Clinton and the like. Thank you.
So I'd like to take a stab at answering Richard's question, or at least the beginning of it, also raising a question of my own, and it has to do with sort of the dialectic of class struggle and ecology, because I think the metaphor that was raised before about the careening freight train is apt. If we were to take those four quadrants and map them proportionately, the upper left, most dystopian quadrant would be, of course, the one that would be way proportionately larger than all of the rest. But I think on the other hand that if we look at what's happening with ecology, that we do see some areas of opening up of struggle. So for instance, when we take the Paris Treaty, for instance, on the one hand, it doesn't do much at all. It's a handshake. It's not a binding agreement. On the other hand, the goal that it sets of 1.5 degrees Celsius rise is actually only possible, according to a recent study, if we actually dismantle fully 1/3 of the current fossil fuel extraction sites that are currently in existence. Meanwhile, we have trillions, or at least hundreds of billions, possibly trillions internationally being invested to extract more fossil fuels on top of what's already being extracted. So in a way, the very, very mild demands of what we can all agree upon are necessary for climate, to reduce climate change and to ultimately become sustainable, are in a way transitional demands that lead us away from capitalism. And I'll just wrap up on this. The Dakota Access Pipeline struggle is huge in terms of intersectionality because you start with indigenous rights, and of course it's one of the biggest ecological struggles that's taking place right now. Or at Northeastern University, you have an occupation of campus grounds, or at least there was an occupation there. It recently was ended as taking new forms, but highly intersectional struggle as well, where you have SJP, Students for Justice with Palestine, other groups rallying around that in solidarity because it's an issue that intersects with all across. And my stab at the answer, Richard, is that people did that occupation in part because of a memory of Occupy Wall Street, right? And I do think that something of an imprint of a memory of that hope that Bernie gave us will not die, but will find itself sort of transmuted in different forms of struggle that go forward.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you. This is a great event. Sean Kane, Socialist Alternative. You said that it's going to take a generation. I'm just going to make a comment. Seize the time. I think it could happen in the next few years. Happy anniversary, Black Panthers.
All right.
All right, you want me to start with this one?
Sure.
You want it? I'll take. I got a good question, I feel like. All right. Is this on? All right. All right. So, however rigged the Democratic primary was, the fact is Bernie lost, and I think that leaves a lot of us wondering where are we going to go from there, and that's what this whole thing is about, kind of. So my question is, considering the year is 2020, Hillary Clinton is running for re-election, akin to the progress that Bill Clinton made in his first term, passing free trade agreements, perhaps overturning Citizens United, maybe raising taxes on rich people a little bit, probably putting on the back burner her college plan, and definitely not quantitative easing away all of the current student loan debt like Jill Stein proposes. And assuming that we have 3 to 4 years of solid organizational work and knocking on doors, groundwork, voter registration on the far left, probably within the Green Party realm, my question is, who is going to run? Is it going to be Jill Stein, who, has her qualms about her and only gets 2 to 5% in the polls or whatever? Or are we going to pick someone else? And do you have any ideas in terms of names, like specific people? Because Bernie is going to be a Democrat for life, and Elizabeth Warren is definitely not going to run as a Green Party. That's my question.
All right. I think we'll have time for, definitely have time for another round after this. So let's just let the speakers answer those questions, comments, and then we'll.
Take this one first?
Sure, Peter, you go first.
All right, so I don't like to use the term identity politics really because I think it is often used to refer now to a kind of what I would call, kind of upper class or bourgeois form of politics that tries to separate aspects of, say, anti-racism or feminism from other aspects of class politics. But then often people get this sort of impression that if something is an identity, that then that's a distraction from some more authentic kind of class politics, which I think is not what most of the socialists in the tradition that I respect most believe. But it's easy. The point is, to me, from my perspective, all politics are identity politics in some sense. The working class is it's not enough to say we are all exploited as laborers under capitalism, therefore we are a class that fights together. We have to think of ourselves as part of a collective with both shared interests and differences and particularities. And so the recognition of how, the history of white supremacy, the recognition of how patriarchy intersects with that project is very important. But it's certainly true that there are other politics that want to completely separate socialist concerns from, superficial kind of ideas of diversity. But I think, unfortunately, I think that the conversation about that and this presidential election has not made it much better. Has been kind of confused and unfortunate a lot of times. The ecology question, I can only agree that yes, in some ways, the demand to do what needs to be done, given the scale of the climate crisis, is a kind of transitional demand. I mean, given its urgency, I also am at least part of the way there with people like Christian Parenti, who have argued that some really big things are going to have to be done very soon by basically this capitalist economy and these political institutions. I'm not very optimistic about the prospects of them doing it or doing it well, but there's sort of like the medium run, like how do we do this in an eco-socialist way, and then there's the short run, how do we like mitigate damage as quickly as possible. And then the Bernie question, if I was going to say one thing, it would be not obsess about who's running for president in 2020. I think what I'm going to do when I go back to this small, deindustrialized city near New York City where I live is get involved in fairly tedious local political projects there, including contesting for power at the level of my city, the level of my county. And it's part of the problem of Bernie. I mean, yeah, he lost. On the other hand, you have to remember, a year ago nobody thought he was going to come anywhere near this close. So it was a fantastic thing. But sort of like with Corbyn, the way Richard was talking about it, it was this sort of thing that happened without much underneath it. It sort of called into existence a movement where one had not been before. And so our task, going forward from here, to me, is less to think about, who we should be running for president next, but how do we build the structures underneath that can make whoever we find in 4 years more successful and more and make that movement more robust.
If you don't mind, I want to focus on this question of identity politics, because in a way, all politics is identity politics. We all start somewhere, We start from our particular interests. Whether you're a worker, whether you're a student, whether you're an old person, whether you're a woman who suffers sexism in her job, or whether you're a black person who's getting beaten up by the cops, essentially you're starting from a point of view of experience. And then the point of politics is that is universalized. Experience becomes universalized because it's linked to a chain of others' experiences in a chain of equivalence. So we form a sense that other people have interests in common with us, and we form alliances. And that's what politics is about. The hijacking, the instrumentalization of so-called identity politics by Clinton, what one is struck by is how utterly degenerate it is, how utterly filthy the hypocrisy is. This is a woman who spent her career pursuing family values, anti-feminism. This is a woman who spent the 2008 election race-baiting Obama. And now she says, look at all those white Bernie bros. This is the level of politics. This is not but the Democratic Party, of course, has got a long history of looking at social movements, looking at popular movements of the left, looking at critique and saying, okay, that's getting some mileage, so we can take a version of that, a safe version, and we can incorporate it and use it to identify ourselves and define ourselves. So there's absolutely no surprise there. What I'm more concerned about, certainly as far as some trends in the American left are concerned, is the critique of identity politics, the anti-identitarian left, the Adolf Reeds and the rest of them, Michael whatever his name is. Walter Ben Michaels, that's the one. And basically, essentially what comes out of this is the naturalization of a white male sort of perspective on politics, as if it was universal. As if you don't talk about racism, then essentially all the problems of racism disappear. If you don't talk about sexism, then the problem disappears. It's essentially the equivalent of putting on blinders and saying, well, now I can see much more clearly without all these irritating things in my visual field. So I think that we need to think about politics as a struggle in a structure indifference, right? And it's a struggle where necessarily there is always complexity. Necessarily every struggle is an intersectional struggle. The question is not whether it's an intersectional struggle, it's whether we recognize the fact that it's an intersectional struggle, as you just did. So that's where I would leave it on identity politics.
All right, I'm not going to intervene in that debate, but I will say that I disagree somewhat with your assessment, Richard, of Walter Ben Michaels and Adolf Reed's argument, but we can save that for another time. I won't be aggressive as a moderator here. Who else would like to ask a question? You, sir, in the front? Yeah. We'll take 3 questions again. Yeah? In the front here.
In your opinion, what would be the ways in which Antonio Gramsci had called the common sense beliefs, in other words, how would that be able to be criticalized into the good sense beliefs, as he called it, among a huge demographic of the population? So, I mean, if we're talking about all the Bernie supporters and people on the progressive side, in my opinion, for any revolution to succeed, if we're not following the Leninist model, we're going to feel like we need to mobilize a large percentage of the population, part of which still clings to the belief that capitalism is the best bet in town, even though it's clearly working against their own interests. How do we actually engage with those on an ideological discourse level to criticalize the common sense belief, at least it's been in the United States, where capitalism has long since been equated with democracy, freedom, the free market, and so on?
Okay, great. And you in the maroon shirt?
Thanks to you all for being here, and thanks to the organizers of this event. It's really awesome to see so many people out here talking about this. Richard, at the end of your talk, you were talking about why do left-wing governments fail, and you were talking about how essentially you're still running on a capitalist economy. The means of production are privately owned. You have capitalists that are investing. So I was hoping that both of you could talk a little bit about stateless alternatives. Some would call it, anarchism, but things like the Zapatistas, the Black Panthers, the Kurds currently, Republican Spain back in the day, and some people would even argue that decentralized movements like Black Lives Matter could be kind of the next version of this, and I'm wondering, what are your thoughts in terms of stateless solutions and how they fit into the picture?
Okay, great. And one more question? Yes, you?
I echo your comments, thanking all of the organizers and speakers for coming. My question's for you, Richard. I guess on the opposite end of stateless solutions, I'd like to hear a bit more about prospects for Corbyn's UK in the wake of Brexit, which was, this frenzy of takes and analysis, and has sort of died out of conversation in the United States, but also Podemos and the farther left in Spain. Having talked a bit about neoliberal institutions and Syriza, I'm curious what your prognosis for the future elsewhere in the EU.
All right, Richard, you want to go first?
Sure. Let me see. Briefly about stateless solutions. I want to say, first of all, I don't think that all of those that you mentioned were entirely stateless. I don't think Republican Spain was stateless, for example. But I get the point, and I think that there's a long history of socialist organization from below, as it were. There's a history of workers' councils, Soviets. In Chile, you had cordones. You had shura councils in Iran, revolutionary Iran. You had all various attempts to develop institutions that could exercise real power, real authority. In other words, this institution says, you've got to do something, you do it as if it was the government. Those sort of institutions have been crushed out fairly quickly most of the time because it's very difficult to get them up and running when they're surrounded by, capitalist power. But one of the ways in which we can think about this is, you remember the Occupy movement, RIP. The Occupy movement was a sort of really interesting moment because it tried to do three things. One, it tried to do something prefigurative. It tried to organize as if these institutions were like Soviets, were like workers' councils, as if they were little direct democracies in operation. Second of all, they tried to have a forum for debate where you could turn up and have a discussion and argue things out. And, had weird practices with the hands and all the rest of it. But basically, it was a real space for discussion. And then you had something else. It was a platform for organization where you would turn up to one of these things and then you go off and do something else. You go and organize people, trying to get people to join a union or go and protest somewhere. Very interesting experiment. The big mistake, well, it wasn't a mistake. If it was a mistake, it was a forced one. It was that they couldn't occupy somewhere that had any strategic meaning whatsoever. They occupied spaces that didn't matter to anybody and could easily be shut down by overwhelming police power. Back in the day, you organized people who were important in a way to the economy because they were workers, and you occupied a factory and you shut something down. Now, the police would come for you. I mean, certainly this country's got a long history of violent labor struggles, but the point is that when you do that, you're exercising power. That's why they come for you. And so I would say that there is a history to draw on here, and it's a history that we can look to if we want to look for examples of alternatives to purely statist top-down solutions. But I don't think that we can just... I think the fantasy of being outside the state is just that. It's a fantasy. We are all inside the state, whether we like it or not. And even when we set up these institutions, they have some reference to state power. And the state will have some sort of reference to us. Just briefly on Gramsci and common sense beliefs and their conversion. I think we need to think about how ideology works, because quite often we approach it in a very literal way, in a way that misses the point. In Britain, Brexit happened, right? And Brexit happened on the basis of a slogan, take back control. It was a beautiful slogan, because in Britain, nobody feels like they're in control. Since the credit crunch, you were supposed to, on the left, we were supposed to think, oh, right, everybody's going to turn Marxist and we're going to, have a revolution. No, nothing of the sort. People, in first sense, was safety, vote for the centre, and let's try and just do things at least a little bit fairly. And that didn't work, so now, the hard right are getting control. But the point is that when you ask people about the situation in Britain after the credit crunch, and I know that there's similar sort of sentiments here, often you hear the sentiment, why aren't people more angry? And there's a general sense of bewilderment and a sense that things are not making sense and that we're not responding politically in the way that we should. And so when you come up with a slogan that says take back control, what you're doing there is you're metaphorizing a lot of different experiences, different ways of feeling disempowered. Some people feel disempowered because they're middle class and they're stuck in a declining region, along with a lot of other people who are in decline. Some people feel disempowered because they don't like all the immigrants who've moved in next door. Some people feel disempowered because their vote hasn't mattered for years. There's lots of ways of feeling disempowered, but the point is ideology always adverts to and mentions diverse and polyglot levels of experience. And the way in which you talk to people, it's a kind of like a dream work, displacement and metaphor. You talk to people on that level and you form alliances precisely through that strategy. So I would suggest some creative thinking on this front. How can you formalize a slogan that subjectivates a broad and diverse coalition of people? Final thing, just briefly on prospects. Look, I mean, I think Britain is over. I think the idea, I mean, Eliot has the phrase a dream kingdom, a twilight kingdom, and that's what the United Kingdom really is at the moment, because what's going to happen is it's going to go for Brexit. It's probably going to go for hard Brexit, meaning it will not remain part of the single market, meaning it will lose its major trading partners, meaning that it will have lower growth. It will be a meaner country. It will be a country that is losing, and it will be a country run more and more by the hard right. And it will be a country that turns more and more to racism in order to manage this, and it will be one in which Scotland has bolted, because why should Scotland remain attached to a declining former empire? You know, so essentially we're talking about the rump UK, where there used to be a sort of relatively affluent property-owning democracy. In other words, lots of people who owned houses and therefore felt wealthy, no longer feeling particularly wealthy and turning to the right. I think prospects are pretty grim, to be honest, and I think there's the, you know, if you want to talk about fascism in today's age, imagine Trump as president here, imagine the hard right in charge of Britain, and imagine the special relationship as a global pole star of reaction. If you want to think about something grim, there you are.
Well, that's cheery. Yeah. To the sort of Gramscian counter-hegemony question, Richard's points about ideology are well taken, and on the need to kind of figure out ways to speak to people's desires and their perceptions of what's gone wrong in a way that actually works. I would just sort of add the one thing, because you talked a little about sort of persuading people about the problems of capitalism and so on. One, I think, of the great advantages we have now over even not that many years ago, as I think is indicated by that this event happened and that a lot more people here than I think would have been here for an event like this a few years ago, is that it's less necessary to convince people that this system is not working. People perceive that. It's more that, it's the Margaret Thatcher problem. There is no alternative. It's, what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism, or Fredric Jameson's joke. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So it's that elaborating, like what Richard was talking about, this sort of vision of where we can, not sort of like bang people over the head with what's wrong with the system, but actually trying to elaborate a vision of, take back control or whatever it is. What it's sort of a more emancipatory alternative would look like. As for statelessness, statelessness is sort of the horizon of my utopian vision, right? For me, Marxism and anarchism kind of end up in the same place about that, which is why my kind of communism future is one where you don't need sort of big top-down structures to manage scarcity, because that's mostly what they do. So if you don't have the scarcity, you don't need the structures. But yeah, I also agree that there's sort of in practice in our politics today, there's limitations to how much you can sort of carve out your own space while being agnostic to the state. There's Cory Doctorow is one of the science fiction writers I use in the book, and he has a book coming out next year called Walk Away, where the title is this reference to the idea that if you have enough technology, productive technology, your 3D printers, your nanoprobes, all of that, then you can literally just walk away from civilization and just set up your cooperative and just live free, right? Which is, in some ways, it's just a futuristic recapitulation of frontier myth. In reality, you can't. Even if we get a lot more cool gadgetry than we have, and even if it's decentralized in nature, there's limits to how much of that you can do. Because states that are controlled by elites who have resources that we need and a coercive apparatus that we need to dismantle, which will eventually otherwise be turned on us. And so that, to me, is in the immediate term the limit of statelessness, even though I think carving out these sort of autonomous projects can be very valuable both as a prefigurative exercise and just as a way to build people's both political capacities and their kind of their sort of ideological development. So, yeah.
All right, I think we've come to the end of our time, and both of you will be in the lobby afterwards, selling books, presumably, signing books, having a chat, maybe answering a couple more questions. But I'd like to thank you all for coming out. It's been a really stimulating conversation, and thank you for your participation and raising some really good observations and questions at the end. I think that's it. Thank you.